Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're taking a closer look at a topic that's super important here in California: forcible detainer actions.
Oh yeah, those are definitely important.
I mean, even if you're not a landlord or a tenant right now, this stuff can come up in all sorts of ways, especially when we're talking about property rights.
Absolutely. Forcible detainer basically covers the situations where someone's got to go.
Like they're overstaying their welcome, even if they had permission to be there at some point.
You got it. It's not your typical eviction where someone's just behind on rent or something. This is more like when the party's over and someone just won't leave.
Okay. I like that analogy.
Think of it like this. Their legal right to be there is gone. The music stopped. The snacks are all eaten.
So time to go home, right?
Right. But legally speaking, it starts with something called a notice to vacate.
So this is where the official process begins.
Yep. This is the landlord's way of saying, time's up, gotta move out. And in California, we have 3 different types of these notices.
Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. So this is serious business. It's not like a landlord can just send a casual text or slip a note under the door.
Definitely not. There are very specific rules in California about how these notices need to be delivered. It's all about making sure it's done legally and properly.
I'm guessing a quick email wouldn't cut it either.
Nope. We're talking certified mail, personal delivery, even posting it on the door in a certain way. It's all spelled out in the law.
Wow, so even a small mistake could really mess things up for the landlord.
You bet. That's why it's so important for landlords to understand how to do this correctly right from the start.
So having a good lawyer in your corner seems like a pretty smart move.
Absolutely. Especially someone who really knows California law and can guide you through the process.
Okay, so let's say the notice has been delivered all by the book. What if the tenant still doesn't move out?
Then we move on to the next level. The landlord can file a forcible detainer complaint with the court.
Okay, things are getting serious now.
Definitely. This is where we get into the legal battle. The complaint basically says, hey, this person's on my property without permission, and I need the court's help to get them out.
And I'm guessing this complaint has to be really detailed, right?
Oh, yeah. It lays out everything. Information about the property, the lease agreement, why they want the tenant out, proof the notice was properly delivered. It's like building a legal case.
This is starting to sound like a courtroom drama.
It kind of is, but remember, this is real life, and it's people's homes and lives we're talking about.
So we've got the complaint filed. What happens next?
Usually the court sets a date for a hearing, and both the landlord and the tenant get notified. This is when things can get really interesting.
Because this is where they both get to tell their side of the story.
Exactly. Both sides get to present evidence and argue their case in front of a judge.
So what kind of evidence would the landlord typically present?
Well, they usually bring the lease agreement, the notice to vacate, anything that backs up their claim that the tenant shouldn't be there anymore.
What about proof of unpaid rent? Or maybe damages to the property?
Yep, that could be part of it too. It's all about showing the judge why the tenant needs to go.
And what about the tenant? What can they do to defend themselves?
They get their chance too. They can present their own evidence, maybe argue that the landlord didn't follow the rules, or even bring up counterclaims.
So it's a back and forth, a real legal battle.
It is. And having a good lawyer can make a huge difference in how things turn out.
So after the hearing, what happens? The judge makes a decision.
Exactly. The judge considers everything that was presented and then issues what's called a judgment. This basically decides whether the tenant has to leave or not.
So that's the moment of truth, right?
Right. And if the judge sides with the landlord, it's called a judgment for possession.
Meaning the tenant has to go.
Right. But it's not always the end of the story. The tenant can still appeal the judgment.
So they can take the case to a higher court.
Exactly. But appeals can be tricky, and it's usually best to have a lawyer help you with that.
It seems like having legal help throughout this whole process is super important for both sides.
I couldn't agree more. It can make a big difference in how things play out.
So let's say the tenant doesn't appeal, or their appeal fails. What happens then? Is that when the actual eviction happens?
Yes, at that point things get really serious. If the tenant still refuses to leave, the landlord can ask the court for something called a writ of possession.
And what does that do?
That basically gives law enforcement the authority to actually remove the tenant from the property.
Wow. So we're talking about the sheriff's deputy showing up and physically removing the tenant.
Yes, that's exactly what it means. It's a very real and often difficult situation for everyone involved.
This is definitely a lot heavier than I thought it would be.
It's important to remember that behind all the legal stuff, we're talking about people's homes and their lives. These situations can be really tough.
I can only imagine. It's definitely a reminder that even though we're talking about laws and procedures, there's a very real human impact to all of this.
Absolutely. And that's something we should always keep in mind as we navigate these complex issues.
Well said. I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot to think about.
I agree. We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully this has given everyone a good foundation for understanding forcible detainer actions.
So until next time, keep exploring these ideas, stay curious and informed, and we'll see you back here soon for the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back, everyone. You know, as we talk about these forcible detainer cases, it's amazing how much they can differ.
Right. Like each situation's got its own little quirks.
But you know what really gets me? At the end of the day, it often comes down to this one question. Did the tenant have permission to be on the property when this whole thing started?
Huh. That is kind of surprising. You'd think all those other details would matter more, like why they're staying, any problems with the landlord, stuff like that.
It's tempting to think so, right? But legally speaking, it's about that snapshot in time. Did they have the legal right to be there at that moment?
So their past tenancy, their reasons, all that really takes a backseat.
Exactly. The law's pretty black and white on this one. If their right to be there has expired, boom, potential forcible detainer case.
Wow, that's a good reminder for everyone to know their rights and what they're signing up for, whether you're renting or renting out a place.
Absolutely. And it's one of the biggest reasons why having a lawyer can be so crucial. They help you navigate all this stuff and make sure your side of the story is heard.
Makes sense. So we've talked about those notices to vacate, which kind of set the stage. And then if the tenant doesn't budge, it goes to a court hearing, right? Where both sides present their case.
Yep, that's when it gets really interesting, like a legal showdown.
And the evidence they bring can be all over the place, huh?
You name it. Lease agreements, proof of unpaid rent, even photos or testimony about damage to the property, and of course, arguments about whether those notices were delivered correctly. It's all on the table.
Sounds like everyone needs to come prepared to back up what they're saying.
Absolutely. Both sides get to present their case, try to convince the judge. It's a core part of our legal system.
Right. Everyone gets their day in court. That's important.
It is. But let's be real, this process can be intimidating, especially if you're not used to all the legal jargon and procedures.
Which brings us back to why having a lawyer can be such a huge help.
You got it. They can help you understand what's going on, make sure your rights are protected, and level the playing field a bit.
So it's not necessarily about who's morally in the right or wrong, but more about who presents the stronger case legally.
You got it. It's about who can make the most convincing argument within the framework of the law.
And who understands how the whole system works.
Exactly. Knowing the ins and outs of California law, especially for something as specific as forcible detainer, can make all the difference.
So even if a tenant feels they've been wronged by the landlord in some way, that doesn't automatically win them the case.
It's not that simple, unfortunately. The court's looking at a very specific set of facts and laws, not the bigger picture.
It's almost like they're looking through a very narrow lens.
That's a great way to put it. And if the tenant doesn't meet those legal requirements, well, the judge might rule in favor of the landlord.
Which leads to that judgment for possession we talked about earlier, right?
Right. Basically, the court says, okay, landlord, you've got the right to evict this tenant.
And that's when we move to that final stage, the actual eviction, which we touched on before. That's where it gets really real.
Right, it does. The sheriff's deputies, the removal of the tenant and their belongings, it's not something anyone wants to go through.
Yeah, I'm getting the sense that this whole process is pretty intense for everyone involved.
You're absolutely right. There's a lot of stress and emotion tied up in these situations for both sides.
So what are some of the things tenants typically worry about when facing eviction?
I mean, where do we even start? It can be absolutely devastating. You're losing your home. You might have to move quickly, not to mention the financial hit of finding a new place.
And that's not even considering the emotional toll, right?
Right. The stress, the anxiety, the uncertainty of it all, it's a lot to handle, especially if they're already dealing with other difficulties in their life.
Like everything's piling up at once.
It can feel that way. And, you know, sometimes these tenants are already facing financial struggles, health problems, or family issues.
And then eviction comes along and just makes everything worse.
Absolutely. It can be really tough to get back on your feet after something like that.
But, you know, landlords aren't always having a walk in the park either, right?
Of course not. They've got their own set of worries and challenges to deal with.
Like what?
Well, think about it. They're losing rental income. They might have to deal with damage to the property. And then there are legal fees on top of everything else.
Plus the stress of having to go through this whole process in the first place.
Right. It's not like landlords are just sitting back, twirling their mustaches and enjoying this. It's tough for them, too.
It's definitely a reminder that there's more than one side to every story.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth, but we need to remember that there are real people on both sides of this.
So how can we as a society address the human side of these evictions? Like, how do we make it less painful for everyone involved?
Well, I think a big part of it is just raising awareness,
Yeah.
getting people to understand what both landlords and tenants go through.
So we can all have a little more empathy for each other.
Exactly. And maybe even explore ways to resolve these disputes outside of the courtroom.
Like mediation.
Right. That could be a good way to find common ground and solutions that work for everyone without all the legal drama.
It sounds like a much less stressful and confrontational way to handle things.
It can be. As we've been talking, I've been thinking about how eviction cases often reflect bigger societal issues.
Like those underlying problems that lead to these conflicts in the first place.
Exactly. We can't just look at eviction in isolation. We need to think about things like the rising cost of housing, the lack of affordable options, and how that impacts everyone.
It's like all those things are creating a pressure cooker, making it harder for people to keep a roof over their heads.
That's a great way to put it. And when people are struggling to make ends meet, it puts a strain on the whole system.
Leading to more evictions, more people being displaced, and more hardship for everyone.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
So we need to start looking at the bigger picture and coming up with solutions that address the root causes of these problems.
I couldn't agree more. Things like promoting affordable housing, helping people find stable jobs, and building stronger communities, it all plays a part.
It's about creating a system that supports everyone, not just a select few.
As we wrap up this part of our conversation, I'm struck by the idea that these eviction cases, while being about legal matters, are really about something much deeper.
Yeah, like they touch on some fundamental human needs and rights.
Exactly. It's about people's homes, their sense of security, their place in the world.
And how we treat each other as a society, especially those who are struggling.
You said it. It's a reminder that behind all the legal jargon, there are real human stories, real families affected by these decisions.
And we can't forget that. It's not just about winning or losing a case. It's about finding solutions that are fair and humane for everyone.
I think that's a powerful takeaway from our discussion today. Forcible detainer actions might be legal processes, but at their heart, they're about people and how we care for one another.
Well said. I think that's a good place to pause and let our listeners absorb all of this. It's heavy stuff, but important stuff.
I agree. We'll be back in a bit to wrap things up and share some final thoughts.
And we're back. That was a lot to digest. I gotta say, I'm walking away with a whole new understanding of forcible detainer actions in California.
It's definitely not light stuff. But hey, that's what the deep dive is all about, unpacking these complicated topics.
Right. Like, I thought I knew a thing or two about property law, but this whole forcible detainer thing, it's got so many layers.
Oh yeah, it's way more nuanced than most people realize. There are all these little details and legal procedures that can make a big difference in how things shake out.
And knowing your rights is crucial. That's something that's been hammered home for me throughout this whole conversation.
Absolutely. When you know what you're dealing with, you're in a much better position to protect yourself.
One of the biggest eye-openers for me was that whole thing about the narrow legal question at the heart of these cases. Like, it doesn't matter if the tenant has a sob story or feels like they're being treated unfairly. It all boils down to whether they had legal permission to be on the property at that specific point in time.
Bingo. And that's why those notices to vacate are so important. They're not just some random piece of paper. They're the legal foundation for the whole shebang.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how messing up those notices could really backfire on a landlord.
Oh, for sure. One little mistake could derail the entire process. That's why having legal guidance is so important. A good lawyer can help you avoid those pitfalls and make sure everything's done by the book.
Speaking of good practices, I think clear communication between landlords and tenants is key, even before things get to this point.
Couldn't agree more. So many of these disputes could be resolved if people just talk to each other openly and respectfully.
It's all about building a solid relationship, right? One where both sides feel heard and understood.
Exactly. And even if things do escalate, approaching the situation with fairness and empathy can make a world of difference. It doesn't have to be a battle royale.
So we've talked a lot about what happens when things go wrong. But what about prevention? What can landlords and tenants do to avoid these forcible detainer situations in the first place?
Great question. There's actually a lot both sides can do. For landlords, it starts with careful tenant screening, having a rock-solid lease agreement, and clear communication.
Then making sure those maintenance requests get handled promptly. I bet that goes a long way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For tenants, it's all about understanding your lease agreement, paying rent on time, keeping the place in good shape, and talking to your landlord if any issues come up.
It's that classic ounce of prevention idea, right?
Exactly. A little effort up front can save a whole lot of headache down the line.
As we've been digging into this, I've realized that forcible detainer cases are often a symptom of bigger problems.
Oh, totally. We can't ignore things like the crazy high housing costs, the lack of affordable options, and how those factors create tension between landlords and tenants.
It's like a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And these forcible detainer cases are just one way that pressure gets released.
That's a great analogy. It's a reminder that we need to look beyond the individual cases and tackle those bigger systemic issues if we want to create real change.
So it's not just about legal solutions, but also about addressing social and economic inequalities.
Right on. Things like promoting affordable housing, supporting job creation, and strengthening communities, it all ties together.
It's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just those who are already well off.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into forcible detainer actions. It's been quite a journey.
It has. I feel like we've peeled back the layers of this complex issue and gained a much deeper understanding of what's really going on.
My hope is that our listeners are walking away feeling more informed, empowered, and ready to engage in these conversations about housing justice in California.
To all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those minds engaged. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.